Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the North of Fair Conversations podcast without barriers. I'm your host, Doug from Ontario, Canada. Hope everybody's having a good afternoon. Here we are on the 6th of January. You know, I read the news a lot, and I came across the story today. Big headline: Cars crash into London buildings 5 times a month on average, new numbers show. Impaired driving, distractive driving, and pedal confusion all to blame, says the London police. The head of the Ontario Safety League, shocking, that number is actually 50. He said he would have expected at least 5, but 50 is a huge amount. Now, these numbers were obtained through the Freedom of Information request to the London Police that revealed that 47 vehicles crashed into buildings in each of the years of 2023 and 2024. In the first 10 months of 2025, that number was 50. Averaged out, that's 5 cars driving into buildings every single month in London. These types of crashes should make people shake their heads. Now, cars hitting buildings, what's the data actually says, and why professional drivers are being dragged into it without evidence. Now, looking at it here and how comes into this, he goes on to say pedal confusion often happens due to inattention and being distracted. It's also possible that newer drivers haven't had the same amount of experience going into their test since the COVID-19 pandemic, he added. They may have bypassed professional driver training altogether and not have developed their own low speed maneuvering skills before getting their license. He goes on to say professional drivers should be retested every 3 to 5 years. Why is he even bringing this into this article? Because this has nothing to do with cars crashing into buildings. Professional drivers should be retested every 3 to 5 years, he said, while others should be self-tested, re-evaluate their cognitive and mechanical abilities to safely operate an automobile at least every 10 years. The reality is that distraction is the number one leading cause of incidents that we see at the Ontario Safety League, he says. Okay, folks, let's get settled in here. Let's settle in for a clear evidence-based conversation today. Because once again, we've got a headline that sounds dramatic, and it is dramatic. Cars crash into London buildings 5 times a month. And then we've got commentary that doesn't line up with the facts. And when the facts don't line up, that's where we slow down, take a breath, and walk through what's actually happening. So today we're going to talk about what the data really says about those collisions, who's actually involved, and why professional drivers, the people with the highest level of training on the road, are suddenly being dragged into a story that has nothing to do with them. And yes, we're going to talk about young driver training too, because that's where the real gaps are, not in professional ranks. The facts. Let's start with only part of the story that's actually supported by evidence. In the first 10 months of 2025, 50 vehicles hit buildings in London, Ontario. That's 5 a month. That's the number. That's the data. Now, what caused those collisions? And the London police were very clear. Impaired driving, distracted driving, pedal confusion, hitting the gas instead of the brake, navigation errors. That's the list. No mention of commercial vehicles, no mention of professional drivers, no mention of low-speed maneuvering failures, no mention of licensing issues. So right away, we know this is a general driver behavioral problem, not a professional driver problem. The article's logical leap. And here's where the story takes a turn, and not a logical one. The article suddenly introduces a quote from the Ontario Safety League suggesting that some professional drivers may not have mastered low-speed maneuvering and that professional drivers should be retested every 3 to 5 years. But here's the problem. There's no zero evidence connecting professional drivers to the 50 building strikes. Not one statistic, not one police report, not one example. This is what we call narrative stitching. The journalist has a dramatic local story, cars hitting buildings, and then plugs into a generic safety quote that doesn't actually relate to the data. It doesn't relate to the story. It creates the illusion of a connection where none exists. The OSL recommendations, well, let's talk about the recommendations. Retesting professional drivers every 3 to 5 years. On the surface, it sounds like a safety measure. But when you look at the facts, the logic collapses. First, Ontario has hundreds of thousands of commercial class drivers. The Ministry of Transportation already struggles to test new drivers. The idea of retesting every professional driver every 3 to 5 years is operationally impossible. Second, where are the trucks supposed to come from? The MTO doesn't own trucks. Carriers can't pull equipment off the road for retesting. Schools don't have enough vehicles. The entire system would grind to a halt. And third, the recommendations is not connected to the London collisions. The causes were impaired driving, distracted driving, pedal confusion, and navigation errors, not low speed maneuvering failures. And fourth, professional drivers already have to demonstrate low speed mastery to get licensed. It's the core of the test. If you can't back, dock, turn, and control your vehicle at low speed, you fail. You don't get a license. If you fail just one of those on the test, you will not get your license. The logistic problem. So let's dig just a little deeper into the logistics, because this is where the recommendations really fall apart. Every commercial road test requires a truck or a bus, a trailer, a qualified examiner, a test yard, a test route, insurance, scheduling capacity. Ontario does not have the infrastructure to retest hundreds of thousands of professional drivers. It doesn't even have the infrastructure to test the new drivers coming through the system today. This is not a small policy tweak. This is a complete rebuild of the testing system. And for what? To address a problem that professional drivers aren't even involved in? Here's the licensing reality. Now let's talk about what it actually takes to become a professional driver in Ontario. You must complete the mandatory entry-level training program, also known as MELT. You must pass a rigorous in-yard test. You must pass an on-road test. You must demonstrate low-speed control, mirror discipline, hazard scanning, backing, docking, offset maneuvers, turns, the whole package. If you can't do those things, if you can't do just one of those things, you fail. You don't get a license. If you don't get a license, then you're not a professional driver. So the idea that licensed professional drivers haven't mastered low speed maneuvering is simply not true. Misuse safety claims and contradictions. So let's talk about other statements that were thrown into the article. And again, without any evidence, connected them to collisions, because this is where the contradiction really stacks up, really starts to pile up. Newer drivers aren't getting the same amount of experience going into their tests. And then the article says, okay, the newer drivers aren't getting the same experience going through the test since the COVID-19 pandemic, and possibly professional drivers are skipping the whole training process to get their license. So let's talk about so he doesn't define it. So he doesn't say, so when we're talking about new drivers, so he doesn't say new new G class drivers, new G2, new class A, new bus drivers, new commercial drivers. He just says newer drivers, which is vague enough to mean anything and nothing. But the only group that actually fits his description is young G class drivers, beginners. They're the ones who get minimal in-car instruction, rely on parents for real training, struggle with scanning, struggle with pedal control, struggle with distraction. And those behaviors match the causes of the London building strikes. But instead of saying young drivers, he keeps it vague and then pivots to professional drivers. Maybe some drivers bypass training altogether. This is where the logic collapses. You cannot bypass professional driver training and still get a commercial license. To get a Class A, B, C, D, or Z license, you must complete the mandatory training. Pass the in-yard test, pass the road test, demonstrate low-speed control. If you can't do those things, you fail. So the idea that someone bypassed training altogether and still became a licensed professional driver is impossible. He's mixing concerns about young G licensed drivers with accusations aimed at professional drivers, and the two groups have nothing to do with each other. He says multitasking is a lie. This is a distracted driving slogan. And it's fine as a slogan. But professional drivers are trained not to multitask. They're trained to maintain single task focus, manage cognitive load, follow disciplined mirror scanning patterns. They are the least likely group to be fumbling with a phone or a GPS. So dropping multitasking as a lie into a story about building strikes, then applying it applies to professional drivers is a misuse of a slogan. Drivers, and then he says, so the average car driver, everybody who drives your car, I drive a car, I drive a transport truck. Drivers should self-test every 10 years. What test? What criteria? What measurements? What enforcement? It's not a policy, it's a slogan. And here's the contradiction. Professional drivers who are not involved in these collisions should be retested every 3 to 5 years. General drivers who are involved should self-evaluate every 10 years. That doesn't make any sense. The group with the best safety record gets the strictest requirements. The group causing the collisions get a self-reflection exercise. That's not evidence-based policy. It's just a collection of talking points. The pattern behind all of this, he's taking concerns about drivers in general, young G-class drivers, and applying the solution to professional drivers. He's mixing unrelated groups to justify a recommendation that has no evidence behind it. And once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it. The real training gap, young drivers. Let's talk about where the real training gap is. And this is where my own experience comes in. I paid $800 for my daughter's driver training. $800. And I spent more time in car with her than the instructor did. And I'm not alone. Parents across Ontario are doing the real training while the schools are collecting the money. And young drivers often lacked scanning discipline, pedal control, situational awareness, load speed judgment, distraction management. And those behaviors line up perfectly with the causes of the building strikes. This is the group that needs attention, not professional drivers. The collisions involve drivers in general, not professional drivers. The causes are behavioral, not technical. There is no evidence anyone bypassed professional driver training. Multitasking is a lie, is a slogan, not evidence. Self-test every 10 years is a slogan, not a solution. You're going to evaluate yourself. You're going to evaluate yourself as a driver. You're going to give yourself high marks. You say, oh, I'm a damn good driver. And then you hit a telephone pole. Retesting professional drivers, not as it, I mean, it's not feasible. It's actually impossible. Because the Ministry of Transportation is not going to supply the trucks. The carriers are not going to supply the trucks. They are not going to take their vehicles out of commission for a road test. It would be a logistic nightmare. Professional drivers already demonstrate low speed mastery. The real training gap is in the young driver system. Evidence, logic, and lived experience all point in the same direction. Cars are hitting buildings because of driver behavior. Impaired driving, distraction driving, pedal confusion, not because professional drivers lack low speed skills. Professional drivers are being dragged into a story that has nothing to do with them. And the recommendations to retest them every 3 to 5 years is not it is not just unsupported, it's impossible. If we want safer roads, we need honest conversation about training quality, especially for young drivers. We need evidence-based policies, not narrative stitching. And we need to respect the people who actually keep this province moving, the professional drivers who already meet the highest standards on the road. I don't even understand why he would bring professional drivers into this article when the article was solely about cars hitting buildings. And then make a claim that they somehow skipped the whole training process, which, by the way, is mandatory for professional drivers. You have to take that mandatory course. There's no mandatory course for young drivers. You choose to go to driving school. You put your kid in driving school because you don't want to teach them how to drive. And yet, in my lived experience and other people in Ontario echoing the same thing, I spent more in car with my driver, with my daughter while she's driving than the instructor did. And I paid $800 for that. I might as well just taught her how to drive myself. It cost me $800 out of pocket because I thought it would be a better idea for somebody else to teach her how to drive. His logic makes no sense. No, I'm glad you could join me here this afternoon. Yeah, because like I say, I read a lot of news, and yeah, this is actually really happening. And in the first 10 months of 2025, you know, five cars per month for 10 months slamming into buildings for the first 10 months of 2025. That's alarming. That's 50 cars. That's alarming. So the discussion really has to be, you know, if we want safer roads, we need honest conversation about training quality, and especially for young drivers. And we need the evidence-based policy, not a narrative stitching, like I said, like this person has done this in this article, jumping around. The article was strictly cars hitting buildings. Had nothing to do with professional drivers, nothing. But he brings that into the picture. He brings that into the article. And somehow we, professional drivers, should be retested every 3 to 5 years. Every 3 years, we have to have a medical. Everybody, you renew your here in Ontario, you renew your driver's license every 5 years. So you as a car driver, you go in there and you renew it. You have to have another photo taken. Cost you $100. Get your new driver's license. Me, I actually have to go rewrite the test. I have to go rewrite the test. And that means, the sign test. Rewrite the actual, knowledge of driving a transport. And I have to rewrite the air brake license every 5 years. So every 3 years, I have to have a medical. This year, 2026, in July, I have to have my medical done. And then my renewal of my driver's license comes up in, 2.5 years. And I have to do all that stuff. You don't as a car driver. You just go renew it. You don't have to rewrite anything. Maybe that should be one criteria that you just have to go rewrite the test again. You have to pass it to keep your driver's license. I have to. That started long before they came up with the mandatory driver training for professional drivers. We still had to have a medical done. We still had to do the rewrite. And then they brought in the mandatory training if you want to become a professional driver. But this article was specifically only about cars hitting buildings, and then he brings the professional drivers into it without any evidence. So thank you for joining me this afternoon. A rare time for me to get out here. And like I say, yes, I do read news stories. And yes, I am fully aware what happened in Venezuela. Yes, I'm fully aware that United Nations held an emergency meeting. We'll do a segment on that this coming weekend. I already have that segment put together, but I was just flipping through news articles this morning, and this one popped up here. Cars hitting buildings in London, Ontario. Well, all over. It doesn't matter what city. Cars are running into buildings. So I thought I would bring that up especially because he brought in the professional drivers into an article where it had no place to be and brought up. So yeah, take care. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of your week. This is the North Affair podcast, Conversations Without Barriers. I'm your host, Doug. Have a great day, and thank you.